The sad history of enslaved mothers who were forced to breastfeed white babies. These women were chosen from household slaves based on their physical and psychological conditions. The women would be asked to mind her diet and behavior, with special restrictions on intimacy and drinks. Her duties, besides breastfeeding, often consisted of caring for, and sometimes providing preliminary instruction for, the newborn. Slave trade brought favorable advantages to the European Western societies. The main purpose for which they employed slaves was to increase production on their extensive plantations and to work for them there. These slaves were forced to work long hours in the blazing sun without receiving compensation for their labor, since it was required by the Westerners. While the plantation owners increased their productivity, they subjected these slaves to harsh conditions. In addition to their labor on the estates, some slaves were also expected to perform domestic chores, and female slaves were elevated in status in Western societies. Then, a large number of female slaves were brought into the homes of their masters to serve them, especially their mistresses. They were created to take care of their cooking, house cleaning, and laundry. They were also created to assist their multiple child mistresses by carrying and caring for the infants on their behalf. After a while, wet nursing, a practice paid low-class women to breastfeed infants, was replaced by female slaves. In Europe, wet nursing by slaves had gained enormous popularity by the 17th century. Through British settlers, the practice quickly made its way to America. The majority of white mothers then used this nursing as a type of justification to stop breastfeeding their children. To maintain their stature, they took these actions. They avoided breastfeeding in favor of wet nursing, which was done by slave women who were seen as having filthy credentials to do so, since they believed it to be an uncultured, bad practice. When doctors at the time did everything in their power to show that breastfeeding was a harmful practice for women, the practice quickly gained a lot of popularity. It is thought that doctors received substantial pay to generate these reports. The quantity of interaction between black and white women rose as a result of wet nursing. When white women of the plantation house needed wet nurses for their infants, enslaved mothers with a ready supply of breast milk came into close contact with them. As a result, slave owners moved some lactating enslaved women out of the fields and into the big house. Enslaved women did not seek for a promotion away from the fields to serve as wet nurses in their masters' homes, even though doing so may provide some pecuniary rewards to them. They also didn't pursue employment as wet nurses, which would have kept them away from their families and maybe their nursing babies. The idea that working in the large home was better than working in the fields was widely rejected by enslaved women. Wet nursing created emotional anguish among enslaved women because, unlike many white women, they were unable to decide how they would feed their newborns when they were made to feed white infants instead of, or in addition to, their own children. In addition, there were simpler, more appealing ways to pursue independence or better material circumstances. Wet nursing eventually continued to be a supremely gendered type of exploitation for enslaved women that jeopardized their ability to be mothers. The Westerners witnessed the children of slaves growing up in very good health during the period of slavery, while they were losing their own to illness. Due to increased growth and health throughout the early months of life, this led Western women to force slave mothers to begin breastfeeding their own children. The style was highly well-liked by the 18th century. The Western ladies started hunting for female slaves who were nursing their children and bringing them to their homes to assist them in nursing their own children. At this point, when the slaves gave birth, they were forced to stop nursing their own children and start nursing those of their mistresses. When they began nursing the white babies, they were ordered to stop giving their own children the same breast milk. She is breastfeeding the white infant, as seen in the image below, while neglecting her own. After doctors discovered that the constant sucking of intimate active female chest could induce lactation, they later began compelling young, healthy slave women to breastfeed white babies. Since they were unable to feed their children with their own milk, slave mothers developed an alternative method of feeding them. They fed their own infants a concoction that they thought would be a suitable replacement for milk in an effort to keep them alive. When the slave mothers ran out of cow milk to feed their infants, they fed them with contaminated water, which led to a high infant mortality rate during this time. It came a time when slave traders started kidnapping newborn babies from the slave mothers. Some of these mothers were naturally forced to breastfeed other babies who were not theirs, but the whites, this was because the pain in their chest left them with no choice but to breastfeed these other babies who were not theirs, relieve them of breast pain. Those slave mothers who refused to feed white babies were beaten and were sometimes milked like cows to feed white babies. Then, the Western mothers would take their children back from the slave mothers after leaving their infants in their care to breastfeed until they were old enough to do so. Later, it was believed that because the slave mothers' living arrangements were unfit, this may harm or kill their offspring, or the slave mothers themselves might do so. They forced the slave moms to live with them so that they could keep an eye on them. Harriet took care of her smaller siblings since a young age while her mother worked at the big house of her masters. When she was just 5, Mrs. Brodess hired her out as a general heavy cleaner and nursemaid to a local family, called the Cooks. Harriet's life was difficult since Mrs. Cook spanked her for being tardy with her work and neglecting the infants. In the nearby marshes, Harriet also checked on muskrat traps. She once fell unwell from the miserable working circumstances, and was then sent home to heal. Thankfully, because of her mother's skill as a healer, she was able to recover. After that, she was made to work as a nursemaid for a lady by the name of Miss Susan, which was a terrible ordeal. Every time the infant in her care woke up and cried, Harriet received a whipping. Before breakfast, she once endured 5 beatings. She then began to dress in additional layers for protection and even fled for a week. Early in her adolescence, Harriet was struck by a metal weight that an overseer had thrown, causing a severe brain injury. He had been shooting at another slave who was attempting to flee. Her skull may have shattered as a result of the hit. She went ignored for a number of days and suffered from painful headaches, seizures, and unexpected narcoleptic episodes for the remainder of her life. Additionally, it's thought that the injury led to visions and vivid dreams, which she interpreted as divine messages. Despite being illiterate, her mother taught her Bible stories. Instead of the New Testament with its stress on obedience, she favored the Old Testament where slaves were set free. As slaves gained their freedom, this practice started to decline. With the exception of a few African American women who continued wet nursing after slavery was abolished, the practice began to decline as slaves gained their freedom gradually. For many centuries, wet breastfeeding was practiced.